There was some other news today from the Red Chamber, the Senate of Canada. Peter Harder is stepping down as the government's representative in the Senate. For almost 4 years now, Mr. Harder has been the man the Trudeau government has been relying on to try to steward its legislation through the upper chamber. Alberta Senator Grant Mitchell has also been serving as the government liaison in the Red Chamber. Both men have announced that they will be retiring from those functions. Joining me in the studio now is Senator Peter Harder. Thanks for coming in.
Glad to be here.
Okay, I want to start with something. Well, first of all, why the decision? Why step down now?
It's a natural time, given that the Parliament that I've served in this role has come to an end and we're about to start a new Parliament, for there to be a transition to a new leadership team. They will give the energy and the focus and take the modernization process to the next phase, and I'm delighted to pass the baton. I'm going to ask you, because a lot of people don't know what, it was a new position, what the government's representative in the Senate is or was, but I'm going to ask you how you saw it, how you saw that role. Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity. I saw the role as one of representing the government in terms of advancing the government's legislation in the Senate, and that means either sponsoring or finding a sponsor for the legislation, working with the senators that have a particular interest in a subject matter of the bill, but also as the bill advances through the process to make sure it was advancing with the appropriate support and consideration, but also to represent the Senate back to the government when the Senate, in its wisdom, felt that a bill could be improved in a particular fashion. And in that sense, it was a relatively new role. So the independence that I look to the Senate becoming is one of institutional separation, one of bringing your judgment to bear, not out of partisan interest, but out of public policy concern. And at the end of the day, we have a complementary role, and that is to say that the elected chamber ought to be deferred to in terms of having the final say.
So, I mean, I grant it, and it's an interesting point, and that is as this Senate becomes more independent and more nonpartisan, as this Senate becomes more restive and assertive of its rights, you're more often communicating back to the government. But on that first end of it, when the position was first created, Prime Minister had gotten rid of Liberal senators. He chased them from caucus. You then took the job. And a lot of people said, if part of your job is, and I'm referred to it, stewarding the government's legislation through the Senate, that as you don't have half the powers that you need to do it. I mean, this is what was said when you took on the role, that you didn't have the powers to whip, to beat, to threaten, to cajole a caucus. You no longer had a caucus. So in terms of stewarding things through, was that half of the job really non-existent? Or impossible to accomplish?
I can't speak for the challenges that previous leaders of the government in the Senate had, but as the representative of the government, my task was to ensure that the senators were equipped in the best way possible to render judgment on a bill. And I think some data points would be helpful to make the point that you're asking about. In the last Parliament, we dealt with 88 government bills, in a sense the government's agenda. Of those 88 bills, the Senate, in its wisdom, recommended amendments to 32 of those bills, sometimes more than one. In one bill, we recommended almost 100 amendments. And the government accepted in whole or in part amendments on 29 bills. And the Senate accepted the message back from the House of Commons in almost all cases without insisting. And I would say that that is a good track record. If you compare to the previous 4 years of the last Parliament, one bill was amended in the Senate. I should also add that in the 4 years of this new Senate, time allocation was never used. In the 4 years before that, it was used 24 times. So you had time allocation and fewer, almost non-existent amendments. So it was basically a partisan rubber stamp.
So were you relying on more often, because you didn't have whip powers, you didn't have a caucus you could whip. Obviously you had a function of talking to the government about how it was going. You had a function, you say, of recruiting people to sponsor the bill. For example, the marijuana bill, independent Senator Tony Dean took over that bill. But some people said from then on, it was like, for you, it was like herding cats. Because you don't have the time discipline function and all that.
I like cats.
But they're hard to herd. I'm just wondering if a lot of people said that it was not an easy time for someone who doesn't have those powers is a different role.
Legislating should not be easy. there are inherent challenges in any legislature to advance a bill. The challenges in the Senate of Canada are in keeping with that whole notion of you really have to be challenged and appropriately reviewed and examined.
You're going to sit as an independent. Are you going to join one of the caucuses? Because there's now multiple caucuses, even of independent senators.
I think it's premature at this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
That also says something about the new Senate. Is it working? Because we've seen over the last few weeks a complete reconfiguration, not even over the last few years, but since the election, we've seen the announcement of a creation of a progressive caucus. We've seen the creation of a Canadian caucus of senators. Is it working?
Well, I certainly think it is. And I think that the events that you're pointing to are milestones in that evolution. Why do I say that? Well, a new parliament is a logical time of reflecting on configurations. That's number one. Number two, that it would be unrealistic to expect all appointments that Mr. Trudeau has made. He's now made 50, and there are 5 vacancies, and he will make more in the course of this parliament. Would be in one group. That affinity and regional interests and background and experience will cause people to form identities that are different than just one independent group.
As the Senate changed and you were in the thick of it, for example, when the independents became, and most of them are in the independent group, as that became the reality and that became the plurality and then the majority, the absolute majority, it took almost a year to negotiate new resources. So positions on committees and budgets. You now have configurations forming within weeks. Is it going to take years to renegotiate funding and positions on committees? Because that sounds like a technicality, but that's how the Senate works.
Absolutely, and the timing is rather propitious because it is at the beginning of a parliament when a selection committee is struck and the selection committee itself has to be proportional to the groups and the strength of the groups in the Senate to, in a sense, divvy up the assignments by committee and chairs and who sits on what committee. That is what will happen in the coming weeks and months, but I don't view that as a delay. That's the normal process. What did happen, and here is a tribute to all senators, frankly, is that as the Senate evolved in the last parliament, and given the fact we had only one session, there was no institutional mechanism to recalibrate proportionality. And all senators voluntarily said, I think we have to readjust because the Senate has reshaped itself.
One of the biggest adaptations and arguments, quite frankly, over the time you were there, was one group of senators saying, no, we will continue to sit as a caucus, the Conservatives, and raising holy Cain when people said they couldn't do that. Now many of them have left to sit in a group, and there still remains a Conservative caucus. This gets back to that fragmentation. Have you won the battle? And you always argued, no, this is a new Senate and we don't need caucuses. They said that's the antithesis of what the Senate should be. Has that argument then been won, that there are not going to be caucuses in the Senate anymore?
I didn't say there shouldn't be caucuses, but I said that they shouldn't be part of national political caucuses.
Yeah.
And there's only one group that has that remaining, and that is the Conservative Senate Caucus, which is part of the National Conservative Caucus.
And they have the right to continue
and they have the right to continue, and that's for them to decide. I don't think that we should be making rules of, who should be part of what national group. Having said that, I think it's an important statement to make that less and less is the Senate the echo chamber of the partisan dialogue that takes place in the House of Commons.
Is it, you said you liked cats, I said you were herding cats. Was the herding cats tiring? Is this why you're taking the break? Has it been quite it'll be nice just to sit as an independent senator?
It certainly is a challenge performing this role and other roles in the Senate. But I don't for a minute want to give the impression that I'm fatigued and depressed and I'm moving on. I think that, as I said earlier, it's important that the leadership of the government's representative in the Senate ought not to be personalized. It should be institutionalized, and that happens with changes of personalities and the role being expressed in different ways.
Okay, I guess the other question is we'll have to see who the Prime Minister finds to replace you as the new government's representative in the Senate. I want to thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Happy to be here.